work in Missouri, but Kansas City is on a state line, so I see kids in Kansas as well. And I am here with Dan Nash. He's a sergeant with the Missouri State Highway Patrol. And we want to talk to you guys about, even though I know everything around COVID has been exhausting and frustrating, one positive that has happened to us in this time frame is a collaboration between our two agencies. And so we kind of want to highlight how that came about and how it's been working to kind of inspire you guys, whether you're in healthcare or law enforcement or some other agency, kind of how we have made that work and maybe what it would look like for you. Do you have anything you want to add, Dan?
Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Heidi, and I'm glad everyone is here. Again, my name is Dan Nash. I'm the sergeant with the Human Trafficking Unit of the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and I would like to echo really everything that Heidi said. You know, it's been a tough year or year and a half for all of us, but something awesome that came out of that, and, you know, and there's opportunities in everything, is the relationship that we now have with Children's Mercy in Kansas City, because through that, we have been able to help and rescue a whole bunch of kids, some of which we're going to talk about today. And we've been able to create this relationship between hospitals and law enforcement, which is not always there. I mean, sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not there, but we have such a good relationship. And I'm just really happy to be here and share that with you guys.
All right, so what we want you guys to get out of this presentation is to understand how to overcome some barriers that exist, specifically when reporting. And we'll kind of talk about specifically what we experience in our hospital and how we work through that with different agencies to be able to partner with the Highway Patrol, to have a better understanding of really what happens when human trafficking is investigated, and then to understand how the pandemic has really created more vulnerabilities for kids related to trafficking. So just to dive into that part of it, you can see this graphic over here on the screen that if you see the amount of reports that were called in or put in online to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children in 2019, there were a lot of reports, but in 2020, that doubled. And so that's a really interesting statistic, because when you look at child abuse and child sexual abuse reports, they've actually plummeted. So there's this really weird dynamic going on where child abuse reports are going down, but reports of online exploitation are going up. And we have seen that same dynamic at our hospital, where kids coming in for child abuse, for child sexual abuse, those numbers have really dropped off. And yet the kids who do come in, there's a level of exploitation going on with them. We think that a lot of this is due to the fact that kids are not coming into contact with mandated reporters the way they normally do. So child abuse didn't just stop when COVID came around. If anything, it probably has increased because kids are now trapped with their abusers and they don't have a lot of outlets. So normally, you know, kids are going to therapy, they're going to school, they're seeing their primary care doctor, they're coming into an ER, and all those people are mandated reporters. And so if the kid felt safe, they could say to someone, hey, this is happening to me, it gets reported, you know, there's safety plans in place. That's not happening. So that's why reports have dropped off. And yet people are saying, hey, I think kids are being enticed online. There are people who are asking for naked pictures online. There's all types of exploitation happening online because kids are online a lot now. So child abuse reports are down, exploitation is up, if that makes sense. And that's the exact same thing we're seeing at our hospital, as I was saying earlier. So we screen all pubertal patients who come in that have some type of complaint of sexual violence. So they say they've been sexually assaulted, sexually abused, trafficked, whatever it may be. If they're coming in with some complaint, we're screening them for exploitation. And over half the kids we screened in 2020 screened positive, basically meaning they're really high risk for being trafficked, or we know they're being trafficked. So a huge number of kids came in where there's some level of exploitation happening, which is really concerning. So to kind of give you some context for how we used to report human trafficking, basically we had no idea what we were doing, like this picture that you see. So we didn't have a clear-cut way to report trafficking. Of course, we're mandated reporters as healthcare workers. So what was happening is there's a kid who is being trafficked, and we're reporting it to Child Protective Services because that's the mandate. We're reporting it to local law enforcement. But as we all know with trafficking, it's repeated exploitation. There's another element that kind of was missing in that reporting structure, and we didn't really know what to do with it. So in 2016, this is kind of what lit a fire underneath me. I saw a patient. I was a brand new forensic nurse. I did not have formal education on trafficking. I kind of knew what it was, but definitely didn't know how to report it. We had no protocols in place. So I saw this 16-year-old. She was being trafficked in Indiana. She's a ward of the state in Missouri. I'm seeing her in Kansas. So real complicated to begin with. And she didn't say she was being trafficked, of course, like most kids won't. But all the signs pointed to being exploited. So I see her, and she had been in a group home. She ran away with an older girl that she met on Facebook. They're in Indiana. They were pulled over by police, and there were drugs and weapons found in their car. So this older female is arrested. They realize this girl's a missing person in Kansas City. They bring her back to grandma who lives in Kansas. And basically that's the end of it. Everyone's like, okay, well, she's back in a safe place. We're done with this. So I see her, and this girl has cigarette burns all over her body. She has 4 sexually transmitted infections. She has genital trauma. She has tattoos. I mean, everything is pointing to exploitation. And I just had this gut feeling of something is wrong. But I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I don't have a protocol in front of me. I don't have an algorithm. I don't know who to contact. So we call the Human Trafficking Hotline, and they're like, okay, thanks for this information. We'll get back to you in a couple of days. You don't keep people for a couple of days in an ER. So I'm like, she needs someone to come see her now. I don't have a safety plan for this kid. So we call law enforcement in Indiana, and they're like, yeah, that kid's back in your state. Like, I don't know what you need from us. So we call police in Missouri, and they're like, yeah, the crime happened in Indiana. Like, what do you guys want us to do about this? So we called Child Protective Services. It was a weekend, and they're like, yeah, she's safe with grandma. We'll just see her on Monday. So my gut, I'm like, someone needs to come see this kid. Like, I think she's a flight risk. I'm afraid she's going to be trafficked again. And everybody's answer was kind of like, yeah, not my problem. So we send her home with grandma, and I find out that from the FBI later on that she ran that night, and they thought she was being trafficked again. And for me, it was just this gut-wrenching feeling of every system that was in place failed this kid. From us not having a protocol, to not collaborating well with other people, to other agencies not knowing what to do with this information. We really failed this kid by not being prepared. So we changed our processes. We got a lot better at recognizing trafficking and providing education to our staff. So in 2018, we changed our algorithm at the hospital to basically say, when we think a kid's being trafficked, we need to immediately tell the Human Trafficking Hotline and maybe include some federal agencies in our reporting structure so there's more investigation and there's more protection for these kids. So that starts in 2018. We started screening kids for trafficking at this time as well. So of course, if we're screening more, we're gonna identify more kids. You know, that's how it works. So we have more kids that we're identifying, we're reporting all of this, and we're not hearing any feedback. So I think that was something that is really hard for our staff, is you see a really vulnerable kid who is in a dangerous situation, you report it and you never hear anything ever again about how they're doing, if it's being investigated, if someone's been arrested. We later learned that all these reports we had made through the Human Trafficking Hotline weren't going anywhere. So that was definitely a gut punch, I think, to our staff, was to feel like we thought that we were, you know, kind of incorporating this added level of protection, and because it hadn't been set up correctly, that it really was just going into like a void that we had no idea that there was not an added level of investigation happening that we thought there was. So I think at some point it sort of felt like this, like just staring off into this place, feeling like we want to help these kids that we see are really vulnerable, but what are we supposed to do? Like, where are the wraparound services? What does it look like to really have partners that are communicating well with us? We may report something one way, but that communication is not coming back and saying, hey, thanks for that tip. This is what happened with X, Y, and Z, you know, keep it up. So thankfully, in June of last year, the highway patrol, Dan, actually called me and said, hey, we want to start partnering with you guys about human trafficking cases. Here are the services that we can provide to you. We can immediately come in and see a kid who is, in danger. We can look at their phones. We can, give you feedback about what we find out. We, have partners across the entire state, so we can collaborate really well. And for me, I think it was just music to my ears of like, yes, this is exactly what we need. And so we started to change our algorithm, but I'll talk about that in just a little bit. I'm gonna let Dan chime in and kind of talk about what prompted him to reach out to us on his end of things.
So for us, when Heidi's going through this on her end, we are going through something kind of similar on our end. In about 2016, the Missouri State Highway Patrol decided that we really need to get into the human trafficking business, so to speak, that there was a void here and that we needed to start providing services, in a different respect. And one of the first things that we did was start training every trooper that we had in the state. We didn't have a training protocol at the time for that. So we went to Texas, and Texas DPS had created a training program. And we were trained by Texas troopers. And then we brought that training back to Missouri. And now every trooper in Missouri gets that training. And then we thought we needed actually more training. So we actually put 2 more segments of training. So now we actually have 6 days of human trafficking training that our troopers can get, everything from what to do in patrol to what to do as an investigator to how to do proactive human trafficking operations and things of that nature. About the same time, we had a state of Missouri human trafficking hotline. There are several states around the country that have a state hotline, and then there's also the national hotline. We kind of felt like it was duplication of work to have a state hotline and to have a national hotline. It's kind of like having 2 911s. It's like we didn't want people to compete, or we wanted everyone to be clear of who they needed to call. So we're considering getting rid of our hotline, which is ultimately what we did. But before we did that, we wanted to check the national human trafficking hotline and see where those calls were all going. And they weren't coming to the state. And we realized they weren't going to local law enforcement either. They were only going to federal law enforcement. And so we questioned and said, well, where are all those tips going? What's happening with those tips? How many of them are bogus tips? How many are legitimate investigations? How many kids are getting rescued? How many people are getting arrested? And the answer was nobody knew. Nobody literally knew any of that. So we changed the way we do business in Missouri, and now there's a multitude of people that get those tips. Local law enforcement gets some. Well, the Missouri Highway Patrol gets all of them. Federal law enforcement gets them as well. But in Missouri, we track every single tip. So we know every single tip that came in, whether it was something that was not legitimate, whether it was something that came in and maybe KCPD decided they were going to take that one, or they were already looking at it. So we track every single tip. So that is really what spurred the auspices of reaching out to Heidi and Children's Mercy. Was we wanted hospitals and other places to know that, hey, these things are going to be handled differently now. And we wanted to have a relationship specifically with Children's Mercy because they were building such a great program. And we also wanted to kind of speed up the process. So for those of you that may not know, there's going to be a gap between when Heidi or one of her nurses sees the kiddo, and then they have to go and make a report. And then a call taker takes the report, and then they put it through their little system out in Washington, D.C. And then that gets plugged back and ultimately gets emailed out to this group that gets them and then gets to me. Well, sometimes that happens somewhat quickly, depending on how busy the national hotline is. It may be a 2 or 3 hour gap. It may be a 6 hour gap, but it can be up to a 24-hour gap. And we didn't want things to slip through the cracks. So the system that we have in place with Heidi is they still make their reports at the national hotline, but they call us direct via the phone, or which is usually a social worker, but sometimes it's a nurse, but usually it's a social worker from the hospital. And they explain everything to us. They give us all the appropriate information. And a lot of times we can actually be out investigating and be moving forward before we ever even get the hotline tip from the national hotline. Sometimes we've already went and talked to the kiddo. Sometimes we went and got the phone. Sometimes we just do things like start identifying maybe who the trafficker is and start pulling ads off of escort sites or whatever it is. But it gives us a head start, I guess is what I'm going to say. So, all right, Heidi, go ahead to the next slide. So this is kind of where our program started. And just to give you an idea of how it's grown, and I think, you know, Heidi's program has grown very similar to this. We literally went from getting training and starting a full-time human trafficking program on the investigative side, as well as training all of our troopers that are in the field. And we literally go from 41 incidents to 171 incidents to 385 incidents, literally in 3 years. That's the last 3 years. We go from 6 rescues to 25 rescues to 47 rescues. We go from 20 arrests all the way to 206 arrests last year. Currently in 2021, I think we're sitting at about 80 incidents. So, and that's basically 2 months of the year. So at this rate, we're probably talking 550 incidents this year. I think we've already made a rescues. So we're probably talking maybe 100 rescues if this keeps up. So really every year we're like quadrupling what we were doing the year before. Keep going, Heidi. This is just the amount of trainings that we started off doing. COVID kind of interfered in that because we weren't able to do as large of trainings as we have in the past. But now, as we're hopefully getting around the corner on that, we're able to train. So we trained just shy of about 2,000 officers total so far. Keep going, Heidi. And we also, and we're going to talk more about being a team here in just a minute, but it really has to be a team. So not only have we developed a relationship with Heidi and Children's Mercy and with other hospitals, but now we're also, you know, developed relationships with casinos and hotel motels and, you know, SROs at the schools, the school resource officers. They're a great one to partner with. Different hospitals, truck stops, bus depots, train depots, all what we would refer to as the funnel points of people that are being trafficked and people that are being exploited. And then also getting out into the community. So last year, we spoke to around 2,700 people in the community at different events. We've spoken to nearly 4,000 folks total in the last 3 years. And now this year we're starting out with a poster program, which we've done in the past, but we've changed it up this time. And, you know, we have all these different posters that we put together with different victim advocates to really reach out to survivors and reach out to also community members to get people to call and to get people educated on what to look for. Because if you don't know what to look for, you're not going to see it. Just like Heidi didn't know, just like we didn't know, just like law enforcement didn't know. Until you get training, you just don't know. So, all right, keep going. So you got to be a team. This is not something that law enforcement is going to fix. Definitely nothing that law enforcement is going to fix alone. You have to have law enforcement, but you have to have medical professionals. You have to have the mental health people. You have to have the victim advocates. You have to have teachers and school resource officers, because schools are a funnel point. That's where these kids are at. You got to have the prosecutors and the judges, and it's really got to be a full team approach. And if you don't have, and the community, and if you don't have those things, it's not going to really matter. If you just have the police can't fix this. If you just have the hospitals can't fix it. If you just have some victim advocates, they're not going to be able to fix it. If everybody's not together on the same team, then you're not going to be able to fix it. And we're really, really fortunate that here in Missouri, we really have a really good team. We have a statewide human trafficking task force that Heidi's part of, that I'm part of. And we have all these different people from these different disciplines, and everybody's on it, all these different law enforcement agencies. And when everyone is working together, you can really make progress. Unfortunately, I think sometimes it's just the human dynamic. We have egos involved. We have, you know, politics involved. We have lots of different things involved. and not everybody wants to work together for a variety of different reasons. And then what you have is you have a bunch of people that are working in their little silos, and nothing is really getting accomplished on any scale. And I think, you know, we all have to recognize that we're humans, but we have to be able to set aside that and say, you know, we're just here for the victims, we're here for the survivors, we're here for the citizens of our state, and that's what we're trying to do. So keep going, Heidi. So in the first 6 months of working with Children's Mercy and our new partnership, we received 22 calls from them. We identified numerous victims. We arrested numerous suspects. And because of this model, now we have other hospitals that are following suit. We're working on a working group right now with a hospital that is putting together basically in the same kind of system, an adult algorithm for adults, and basically setting up the same kind of guidelines that we can use with adult survivors as well. And it really enables us to really help and assist other agencies through this program. We're going to go through some scenarios here in a minute of which, you know, other agencies, you know, got stuff, and then we were able to go help them once Heidi and her crew called us, and we were able to bring extra resources to the table, like SOS Polygraph and digital forensics, and our kind of what we refer to as a special victims methodology, which is kind of a different way that we have chosen to interview these folks, which is really kind of a lack of interview, so to speak, which is really quite different than most other states. And that's, again, basically a foundation off of this program that we have with Children's Mercy. Keep going. So again, obviously this is victim-centered. We're putting the safety and well-being of the victim first. That doesn't mean that we're not going to investigate, or if the victim, a lot of victims sometimes will be like, yeah, I don't really want to make a report. That doesn't mean that we're not going to try to figure out who that trafficker is and arrest that trafficker. It just means we're not going to involve the victim. And if she doesn't want to cooperate, or he doesn't want to cooperate, that's fine. That's their choice. The other thing that we do is we have something called working backwards. And historically, law enforcement, so like an example would be, you have a kiddo that's 15 and she shows up at Children's Mercy, and she says, I've been meeting people online, and I've been sending nude photos back and forth to people online, and I've been receiving nude photos from other people online. If that person is an adult, or they're adults, law enforcement goes after them, as well we should, and we try to put them in jail. But if it's a juvenile, historically law enforcement doesn't do that. We turn that over to a juvenile officer, or the parents, or both, and say, hey, your kid has been sending nude photos, just letting you know. We're just going to let the juvenile officer and the parents take care of it, and we're going to move on to other things. And what we discovered was that is a mistake. So as we started doing research on these kiddos that are involved in this kind of behavior, what we found is about 2/3 of the time, there's some dysfunctional situation going on in the family. And if we can get a victim advocate involved and work on whatever dysfunction is going on in that family to make that kid vulnerable, to make that kid want to send these nude photos, we can a lot of times probably stop that kid from maybe being exploited or maybe being a trafficking victim down the road. But the big part that we found was about 1/3 of those kids are already victims. So by the time they're sending nude photos online, they've already been victimized by somebody. And what we found is that is usually somebody close to that kid. It's Uncle Jim, or it's grandpa, or it's mom's boyfriend, or it's neighbor down the road, or a teacher, or a coach, or someone close to that kid that has already victimized them. And we were missing all those because we weren't working backwards. We were not asking that question. Why is this kid engaged in this activity? Why is this kid sending all these nude photos? We were just going, well, kids will be kids. That's just the way kids are nowadays. And we let the parents deal with it. That was a mistake. So we kind of changed that. And we changed our whole mindset of trying to, really be victim-centered, recognizing that these folks are trauma bonded, and working backwards. Okay, Heidi. You're muted.
Thank you. So some barriers that we initially ran into. So, you know, of course, I work in this huge healthcare system. So making a change, it's not just like, oh, I decided that I, you know, magically want to start reporting to the Highway Patrol. There's about 70, you know, people that I have to go through to make that happen. And so there definitely were barriers to changing our algorithm. So just to kind of highlight some that I think a lot of healthcare workers would probably run into, or really other agencies, kind of the first thing was we let other law enforcement agencies know, hey, we're going to bring the Highway Patrol in. And immediately there was just kind of this sense of a territory battle. Like, no, we don't want you to report to them. This is our thing. We're the human trafficking experts. And we'll kind of talk about how we overcame that. So that was sort of the first step, to get all the different law enforcement agencies in agreement into how we were reporting. And then the next kind of battle we had to fight was we brought in the key stakeholders saying, hey, we want to add one more agency to our reporting. And it's already kind of a long reporting process because we have to report to Child Protective Services, local law enforcement, the Human Trafficking Hotline. Now we're going to call Highway Patrol and some other federal agencies. And our social workers were like, no way, we're not calling one more place. Like, you guys keep adding and adding to our plate. And so again, we'll kind of talk about how we overcame that. So that was the next hurdle that we had to overcome. And then I think, of course, just like any change that gets made in any type of, you know, gigantic place, it's sort of like, why are we doing this? The way we're reporting works perfectly fine. Why are we changing it? You know, just kind of that resistance to change. And so again, really being able to highlight, hey, the Highway Patrol can respond immediately. They can give us real-time feedback of, hey, this is what the information we need. This is what we're going to do. You know, we're going to come see this kid and look at their phone or whatever it may be in that moment. We really needed that real-time feedback in the ER. Hey, this is what law enforcement is asking us to do. And so that was kind of how we won people over. And then other barriers that exist that I've heard in the adult world, because in working with kids, you know, we're mandated reporters. We have to report it. A kid doesn't consent to that. They don't have a choice. But adults, you know, they can consent to treatment. They can consent to law enforcement being involved. And so a lot of adult hospitals are saying, well, this is a violation of patient privacy. If you're reporting to law enforcement and they don't want law enforcement involved, you're breaking the law, essentially. Or you're breaking Hipaa, which is the federal law that protects your privacy in healthcare settings. And so, again, we'll talk about how to overcome that in a second. And then I think other people kind of, you know, will throw up barriers of, well, you know, law enforcement doesn't understand trafficking. This could be more traumatizing for victims. And I think Dan did a really good job of showing and explaining they are very victim-centered, and they're not going to force someone into an investigation. So some solutions that we came up with to sort of overcome these different things is, for the first one, with sort of the territory battles, I approached Dan and said, hey, these agencies kind of are having heartburn about this. And he thankfully was like, I will talk to them and we'll sit down and meet with them. And so they were able to come up with an agreement, you know, kind of everyone's still going to get the same information. The order of it may change a little bit depending on what state we're talking about, but everyone's still going to get a chance to work on these investigations. And so I think that was really helpful to have law enforcement communicate with each other to resolve that issue. Instead of me, the healthcare worker, trying to resolve that, it wouldn't have worked. So that was definitely helpful. And then what we did internally in the hospital, because we recognize we're asking social work to take on this huge burden of reporting, you know, to 6 different agencies or whatever it may be. So the nurses said, we will take some of that reporting on. So they report, depending on the situation, they report to certain agencies, we report to others, so that it all gets done at once for a patient. And it's worked out beautifully. It's worked out very well to kind of share that burden. And then I think another huge factor is to kind of vet the agency that you are going to work with. So we talked to the Attorney General's office and different nonprofits and other groups that have worked with the Highway Patrol that said, yeah, they're awesome. Like, we can vouch for them. They do awesome work around trafficking. And so I think that was kind of another thing to say, yes, this is a good idea. Let's move forward with this. In terms of Hipaa reporting, there is an actual Hipaa exception. If you look at the federal law that says you can report patient health information, to law enforcement without a patient's consent if they're in imminent danger. I think we would all agree patients who are being trafficked are in imminent danger. We know trafficking victims are frequently beaten, raped, killed. And so I know a lot of hospital lawyers would not agree with me on this, but really looking at the laws and having a conversation with your hospital to say, this is what the actual law says. Can we report this? If your hospitals are still getting pushback, I think something to think about is anonymous reporting. And so that means making a report to the human trafficking hotline, not giving any patient identifiers, but giving information that would still be helpful. You know, like there's a reported trafficker that hangs out at this area every Saturday night, or whatever it may be, something that would still help law enforcement, but you're not violating that patient's privacy or any of their information. So that's maybe kind of a workaround as well. Anything you want to add to that, Dan?
So one of the things that we did, we did have, and it's usually lawyers, hospital lawyers that cause the speed bumps. So one of the things that we did is we reached out to pretty much like the premier law firm that does nothing except sue hospitals. And we reached out to them because everybody said they're the experts in HIPAA. First, we went to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General said, nope, there's a clear exception, a law enforcement exception to HIPAA. So then we went to this private law firm who, like I said, they do nothing but sue hospitals. And they said, no, there's a clear exception in HIPAA for this. So then they gave an opinion. So now you've got an EG opinion, and you've got this major law firm opinion that does nothing but work in the HIPAA world. And so that enabled us to really get around any issues of hospital lawyers basically saying, oh yeah, you can't give this information out. And we're not, like I said earlier, we're not going to force anyone to cooperate with the police. If they don't want to report, they don't want to report. But you have to understand that not only is that person a victim, but on average, most traffickers have between 4 and 5 victims. So what about those other 4 girls? What about those other 5 girls? Maybe one of them wants help. So like things that we've been able to do is, okay, this person doesn't want to talk to the police. She doesn't want to make a report. But if I can just get it like a phone number, a lot of times with just a phone number, I can do a zillion things, and we can start a whole investigation a lot of times with something as simple as that, and that we never have to involve that victim who doesn't want to cooperate. That's their right. Although I have kind of my weird opinions about that as well. Kind of we used to not prosecute domestic violence because the wife didn't want to cooperate after the husband beat her up. Obviously, it's the same kind of situation in my mind. But so we can do great things with just something as simple as a phone number, or like Heidi said, hey, we just have this information, and we never have to include, because we're never going to force a survivor to be in a situation that she doesn't want to be in. So there are workarounds that actually have worked pretty good for us.
All right, so we wanted to give you guys some real life examples just to show how incredibly helpful this partnership has been for both of us. Just in terms of maybe identification on our end and what that has led to on the law enforcement side of things. So the first patient we want to talk about was a 15-year-old female. She had a long history of emotional trauma. Both of her parents were deceased. She has 7 siblings. She doesn't live with any of them. She just lives with her grandparents. She has a diagnosis of reactive attachment disorder, ADHD. She's bipolar. She also has a history of suicidal ideations and inpatient stays at psych facilities. And I am not giving you this information to like discount any of this story. I'm showing you kind of the vulnerabilities and the risk factors that already exist for this kid to be targeted and exploited. So she showed up in our emergency department after a suicide attempt. That's kind of how we encountered her. So what had happened prior to the suicide attempt is her grandma had looked at her phone and seen multiple incidents of exploitation happening. Just that day alone, she had sent nude images to over 14 different adult males. So of course, grandma was horrified by this. The patient also disclosed that she had had sex with a stranger that she had met online just a few days before. Also, incidentally, so this kind of very high risk behavior had been going on for a while. Law enforcement from Iowa had actually contacted the grandparents several months before saying, we just arrested this adult male who was planning on meeting your granddaughter in person. They've been talking online. So definitely being targeted for sure. So the grandma confronted the patient, saying, hey, what is with all of these pictures? What's going on? The patient was really upset and swallowed a handful of pills. So grandma called an ambulance brought her to our ER. One of our nurses was involved since she had disclosed the sexual assault that had happened a few days before. She's 15, she cannot consent to having sex with an adult. And so she agreed to a forensic exam. Because of everything that was going on with her, this prompted us to call the Highway Patrol and the human trafficking hotline with concerns of exploitation. You're muted.
Thank you. So Heidi calls, one of her social workers calls, I don't remember which, probably one of the social workers, and gives us this information. And obviously, as mandated reporters, they reported it to Children's Protective Services, and then also local law enforcement had been contacted, and I think they made a report to the hotline, and then they'd called us. And what we did is we immediately reached out to local law enforcement to say, hey, what can we do to help you? Do you need some help? And things of that nature. And just to give you a little background, because every state is a little bit different. And I know a lot of you are probably in California, or at least some of you are in California. So the way we're set up in Missouri is we're the Missouri State Highway Patrol, but we basically have full state police power authority. So I know, like in California, I think the way I understand it out there is California Highway Patrol just does like the highways and stops cars and works accidents and things like that, or at least we also do that, obviously, but we do everything else too. And we have a full investigative division. So that's kind of where the human trafficking unit comes from and where our investigative side comes from. I didn't want there to be any misunderstandings about that. So we reached out and the local sheriff's department and said, hey, we got this tip, got this call from the hotline from the hospital. What are you guys doing with it? And depending on the size of the agency, 1 or 2 or 3 different things may happen. If it's a small agency and it's a rural agency, normally what happens is, yeah, we got this call. We have no idea what to do with it. Can you guys just do it? Or it'll be, yeah, we got this call. We're not 100% sure what to do with it, but we would like to learn. Can you guys help us and show us what to do with it? Or sometimes, like the larger agencies, we have a really good rapport with, like KCPD, for example, and I'll just talk to their sergeant and he'll say, yeah, we'll just take it. We're good with it. Sometimes if they're super busy, they got a zillion things going on, they'll say, yeah, we don't have anybody to deal with it right now, and then we'll just deal with it. So that's kind of how it works. In this particular case, I ended up talking to the detective that had the case, and he was fairly young detective, didn't have a whole lot of experience as an investigator. And when I was talking to him, he said, well, I've looked through the phone and it looks to me like this is all really consensual. It's basically just consensual prostitution. And I remember thinking, okay, this is a really good opportunity. And what is it an opportunity for? It's a really good opportunity to guide and counsel, right? And so I had to explain, she's 15. There cannot be any consensual prostitution between her and anybody. It's an automatic crime. And then I said, plus, it's my understanding that there were some other people that were involved that were maybe setting up the dates and, setting up different things like that. And if that's the case, then maybe she's being trafficked. And it changed that particular individual's mindset to go, you're right. Maybe I was thinking about this wrong. And most importantly, their boss ended up calling me and we ended up talking, and they were like, yeah, maybe we're thinking about this wrong. And what it enabled us to do was teach basically our human trafficking training to everybody in that entire department. And then we were able to change the entire mindset of that entire agency. And now they're doing things completely differently. They're not looking at it as, oh, that's just some prostitute. they're like, wow, this is really probably a victim. We need to do this and we need to do that. So it really was an opportunity. And now we work hand in hand with them all the time. And now they're even part of our Attorney General's Office Human Trafficking Task Force. So it's went all the way to that from where we started, and we couldn't have done that without Heidi and her crew.
Yeah, definitely just really encouraging to see the ripple effect and to hear that feedback. You know, I think for our staff, it's really helpful too. So this second case study was a 14-year-old male. He had met an adult male on the app Grinder. And so these two were talking, they were sending each other nude photos, which already is illegal, right? This 14-year-old cannot do that consensually. He ended up meeting the 14-year-old patient ended up meeting this adult male in person. The perpetrator took him to a store to buy women's lingerie. When they went back to the perpetrator's apartment, he told our patient that he needed to shower. He put this lingerie on him, took photos. Then the perpetrator ended up sexually assaulting really violently and strangling this patient. He also showed the patient videos of child sexual abuse. And the patient had told one of our nurses he thought that his sexual assault had been recorded on a laptop. The way he ended up in our hospital is that the perpetrator dropped him off at home. He was sneaking back into the house. His mom caught him and confronted him, and he disclosed the sexual assault. So our nurse, you know, was very perceptive and was like, clearly exploitation is going on. This kid's being, you know, groomed, sexually assaulted, it's being filmed. So she reached out to the highway patrol about this.
So when we got this case, you know, the first thing that we wanted to do was get the phone. Whenever you have electronic devices involved in these cases, that is always the first thing that we want to do, because that's evidence that can be, you know, destroyed. It can be, you know, stepped on, run over with a car, beat with a hammer, thrown in a lake, whatever, that can be destroyed. We can recover some of that information, even if you do beat up the phone, maybe. And we can get some of it from service providers and things like that, but you're never going to get all of it. So we want to get the phone, the computer, anything like that that's involved in one of these cases right off the bat. So that's what we did, and we immediately started dumping the phone and the juvenile's laptop. And just from looking at that, we found some 50-some men that the juvenile was speaking to online. And we eventually whittled that number down to about 9 men from 3 different states that had traveled to meet this young man, and eventually either molested him, sexually assaulted him, took photos, videos. And then on one particular occasion, they brought another juvenile with them and had both the juveniles have sex together and take pictures of them and videotape them. And this young man's story is pretty stereotypical for what we see when it comes to these victims. It all started with him. He was 14, I think, when they disclosed or discovered him at the hospital. It all started for him when he was 9. He was molested by his uncle from the time that he was 9 until he was 11. And that is a common thing that we see. In fact, I'm not sure that I've ever interviewed one of these victims that was not molested as a child. I mean, it's pretty much just standard protocol that somebody molested them when they were a kid, and that's what started this whole thing going down the road. And it doesn't matter if they're from a poor family or they're from a rich family or a middle-class family. It doesn't matter their gender. It doesn't matter what race they are. None of that matters in this world. All that matters is almost always they were molested and sexually abused as a child. So that's pretty much stereotypically what we see. And it's what we see in this case. In fact, what we also found in this case was not only did the uncle molest him, but the uncle had molested 4 other kids. And law enforcement, it was local law enforcement, small town, didn't really take it seriously. And so this kid now has been molested, he's been abused. Law enforcement didn't take it seriously, didn't believe him, didn't believe the other kids that were reporting this. So now he's got all that. He's very vulnerable. He gets online. He was drinking alcohol from the age of 12, which again is not uncommon for them to go into the drug and alcohol abuse to cover up the trauma. And then eventually he ends up in this situation where now he's being exploited and assaulted and videotaped and dressed up in women's lingerie and all the other stuff that's happening to him. So ultimately in this case, we arrested several different suspects. And the sad part about this whole case is, I think it's on the next slide. Is there a next slide, Heidi?
Yeah.
The sad part about this is this poor kid is in some pretty intensive therapy now. I mean, think about all that this poor kid has been through. And, you know, so we're going to trial, getting ready to deal with these offenders. And the kid ends up breaking a bottle and ends up cutting his throat with the bottle. Doesn't kill himself, but injures himself. And now he is in like he actually went to an institution, and now he's in a foster care system because mom is saying, I can't deal with him at 15 years old. I don't know what to do with him. And again, the kid is, you know, what situation is he in now? I mean, it's now his own family is not even trying to take care of him. So, I mean, my heart just breaks for these poor kids every time.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is a really good example of why protective factors and preventing this before it ever happens is so important, because I think once the exploitation occurs, the fallout is so dire for a lot of kids, and there aren't always a lot of resources for them. So that's definitely a heartbreaking one. Okay, so our next case study is a 7-year-old that we saw at the hospital. They had an adult male who was babysitting her. It was a family friend. So he called mom. Mom was out running errands. He was just babysitting for a little bit of time and said, hey, just FYI, she smashed her finger in the door when we were playing hide and seek. It actually was, her finger was smashed really bad. She actually had to go to the ER for that. But he was kind of trying to cover his tracks. So mom gets home, sees the patient's finger, and is like, oh my gosh, what happened? And the patient says, well, I was trying to hide from the perpetrator because he tickled my pee-pee and disclosed that he had licked her genitals. The mom also disclosed to us at the hospital that she thought the reported perpetrator had taken videos and photos of the assault while it was taking place. So of course, instantly we think exploitation's going on. So we called the highway patrol with this case.
So what we did with this case is we immediately called local law enforcement just to, you know, make sure and see what they were doing, if they were doing anything. And they were trying to do some stuff. They just needed some guidance and some counseling again. So they did tell us in the initial phone call that the mother thought, because she has a security system in her house and she has a security system in like the living room area, and she thought she might have some of this activity on the security camera, and she totally did. She had the suspect basically putting the 7-year-old girl down on a couch, kind of fold out couch thing. And he performed oral sex on her. He did other things to her. He touched her. He took video and photos of her. But then the other thing that he did was after he did those things and he took video and photos of her, he stood up over her in front of her and kind of spread her legs apart so he could see her genitals. And then he proceeded to masturbate and he ejaculated on her. And so I told the local officer, I said, hey, this guy's done this before. That is not his first time. I mean, he's displaying her out. He's very calm about it. He's very matter of fact about it. This is part of his protocols, part of his paraphilia. And so this is what we should probably do. And they were like, yeah, you just tell us what to do. We'll do it, whatever. So what we did is we asked, the subject was still cooperative at this point, and we asked him if he would take an SOS polygraph. The SOS polygraph stands for Sex Offender Survey Polygraph. Some agencies call it a tactical polygraph, and it's a special kind of polygraph that we use on sex offenders and trafficking cases. And we didn't create the SOS polygraph. The Pennsylvania State Police did, and we just basically stole it from them. I mean, if someone else has created something, steal it from them. I mean, steal it from them and use it, right? So that's what we did. We took it from the Pennsylvania State Police. We expanded the usage a little bit in Missouri. Now we use it on child porn cases. We use it on sex offender registration cases. We use it on human trafficking and exploitation cases. And the whole purpose of it is to locate and find live victims. And the SOS polygraph allows us to do that. We find the most live victims that we've ever found with one suspect on an SOS polygraph is 9. But we've found 7 and 6 and 5 and 4, and we find them. So this suspect agreed to take the SOS polygraph. Of course, he flunks, and he immediately starts disclosing another victim. And we were able to go and find, I think she was 11 or 10, another victim in the same town who had never disclosed, never told her mom, never told her dad, never told her kid from school counselor, had never disclosed to anybody. And we were able to go and find that victim. She ultimately did disclose in a forensic interview that she had been abused. But that's a kid that needs some help, that needs counseling, that needs some therapy. Otherwise, you know, where is she going to go? Where is she going to start drinking? Do you use drugs, sending nude photos, end up being exploited, end up being trafficked? Who knows what? But we would have found the other victim without Heidi calling us, saying, this is what we got, allowing us to work backwards, and then allowing us to do the SOS polygraph and send that person away for a really long time and help this other victim.
All right, our last case study. So this is a 16-year-old that we saw at the hospital. Her backstory is she had run away from home several months before and met a friend through her cousin. This friend was an adult male who had been incarcerated for 13 years and had just gotten out of prison. He took the patient home with him, and then he held her against her will for several months. When she tried to leave, he would threaten to kill her, threaten to kill her family. Kind of classic grooming with trafficking. So he would give her cash. He paid for her to get her nails and her hair done. He paid for her cell phone. And in exchange, he was repeatedly raping, beating, manipulating this girl. She went through a horrific situation with him. So unfortunately, she came into contact with our healthcare system repeatedly during this time of her being trafficked and exploited, and we failed to recognize it. You know, she was coming into different parts of our healthcare system, but no one was connecting the dots, because every time she was coming in or calling us, it was for some kind of concern related to an STD or a pregnancy concern. And unfortunately, no one connected those dots until she was in our ER. So quickly, why were we not recognizing her? I think part of it is still just the lack of education throughout our healthcare system. Even though we've done a lot of work, I think there's still work to be done, obviously. And we work in silos, right? So you have an urgent care that maybe is not looking at ER documentation, who's not looking at primary care documentation. So nobody's kind of following her whole story of what's going on. And then we don't have universal screening for patients either for trafficking. And so if we had that in place, that may have brought some red flags to light. So the way she ended up being identified is she was in a high-speed chase with her trafficker. They were running from law enforcement. Sounds like there were weapons involved. They ended up wrecking. And so, you know, she ended up being arrested along with her trafficker. She was taken into custody. While she was in juvenile detention, she was complaining of pain. So they brought her into the hospital. She was handcuffed, shackled. So again, misidentified on multiple levels, I think by different systems that she was encountering. She was in state custody at this point as well in terms of like consent, parental stuff. The state had was signing everything for her. So she thankfully felt comfortable with our ER staff and disclosed that she had recently been sexually assaulted by her perpetrator, which prompted one of our nurses to come in. Our nurse talked to her, and it was just like word vomit. It was a safe person, and she just disclosed everything that had been going on the last few months. And our nurse said it was almost just like the blinders had come off of her eyes, that she was crying and just saying, I see now that he was using me. You know, she wanted her mom, just in this very vulnerable place. So our nurse was really advocating to get the highway patrol involved with this patient, because obviously we know they understand trafficking and grooming and the trauma that goes into that. And we felt like charging this patient as an adult for crimes the trafficker had forced her to commit really wasn't in her best interest. This patient also had numerous scars and injuries in various stages of healing just from her beatings from her trafficker. She has scratches on her face from him. And so again, I think if people had just asked her simple questions along the way, it would have been clear she was being abused. So this was one where we really felt like there were multiple missed opportunities from our end and law enforcement end as well.
So unfortunately, I mean, Heidi's near perfect and her crew is near perfect, but they're not perfect. You know what I mean? We're all human. We miss stuff, they miss stuff. I got a call the other day from a hospital who had a patient come in 62 times, and for a variety of things, from STDs to suicides to drug overdoses, and they had never put it together. She had seen like 9 or 10 different nurses and different doctors, and finally, when one particular nurse started putting it together and started asking the right questions, she just went, bleh, like Heidi said, and just vomited all the stuff that had been happening to her. And it happens with us too. I mean, law enforcement, we have contact with these people sometimes over and over and over and over again, and we're not putting it together. And then the right patrol officer who's very kind and very friendly, or the right detective who's very kind and very friendly, you start talking to them and you buy them a milkshake. That's kind of like an investigator's secret right there. Everybody loves milkshakes. Give them a milkshake. Now you're friends, right? And all of a sudden they start telling you all this stuff. So I mean, it happens to all of us. We're not perfect. We just want to continually always improve, right? And that's why, I don't know if everybody knows this, but research says between 80 and 88% of human trafficking victims are at the hospital at some point, but the hospitals are only reporting 2 to 4% of all those victims. So, I mean, it's an educational thing. It's a busy thing. It's you know, a lot of different things. So in this particular case, we were able to kind of intervene. This was a large agency actually, but we get along good with them, and we were able to talk to them and say, hey, do you want us to deal with this? We will. And from talking to their detectives, they were like, no, we get it. The patrol guy should not have put her in juvenile custody. Now we'll fix it. We'll take care of it. And ultimately that's the worst thing you can do to that girl. And she got out of that, and then she got a forensic interview done, and now there's some other things, that they're trying to do for her, but she's a super vulnerable young lady. If I remember correctly, her father is passed away. I think he died of an overdose or got shot or something. Mom was like in and out of jail. That poor little girl has got like nobody. So she's super, super vulnerable. And unfortunately, she was in a car chase with her trafficker, and I'm just thankful for Heidi and her crew that caught her, because otherwise she'd still be sitting in juvenile detention today. And as soon as she got out, she'd just be picked up by another trafficker and go right back down that road. So at least there's a chance that we can maybe help her at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, now we're almost out of time, so I will just say real quickly in conclusion, I'm sure as you guys can see, collaborating has been so helpful for both of our agencies. And really, I think it adds an added layer of protection for kids and just a morale boost to work together so well. Are you okay if I just skip through this to our contact info, Dan? Okay. So here's our contact information. I want you guys to have that. If you have any questions or want to talk to us offline, we're happy to chat. But I just wanted to open it up to questions real quick. And I know we're at the end, so if you need to leave, that's no problem. But if you want to stay a little longer and ask us questions, we're happy to field those as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Heidi and Dan. I mean, that was a lot of really tough information, but really insightful for how to build relationships. One of the questions that did come up that I want to address, and I'm going to combine the two for time's sake, but it was whether, Dan, you had mentioned this idea of a true team. So whether or not your guys' true team does or plans to have any survivor leaders, and also what advice would you give people who are in a state or a county that doesn't have a team like this to start building one?
So the answer to that is yes, we do have survivors in the task force. We have like Christine McDonald, for example. She's written books. She's testified in front of Congress several times. She's part of our task force. We do, they're obviously a key part of that. We have like a drop-in center in Kansas City called Christine's Place that was named after her. They're part of the task force. So we have all that in place. What would I say about other states that don't have this team? You need to build a team. And fortunately, we can actually help you with that. So we are currently working with at least 5 other states currently to help build their teams. I'm personally going to be going to Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Iowa, and a couple of other states to put some training on for them. We've done that with Kansas and Nebraska already. Allison, who's the director of our task force, she's working with other states as well on things. So it's like everything. I mean, we didn't create some of these things. The original training we got from Texas, the SOS polygraph we got from Pennsylvania. I mean, have other people help you get started if you, rather than start from scratch. I would not recommend that. Have other people that have done it help you, and you can save yourself all that time of the stuff that works, the stuff that doesn't work. So you can email me and I will help you down that road if that's something you want to do.
Yeah, and I would say to echo that, I completely agree with having a survivors' voices and survivor leaders is so important. Of course, we don't want to discount that or act like we have it all figured out between the two of us. We absolutely need survivors to give their input and talk about their experiences and what works and what doesn't. And we do have survivors that we work with, not only in the task force, but in our community, that we ask their opinion about certain things, like about posters in our hospital or cards that we give out. You know, is this effective? Would this help, you know, in a situation? So definitely something we value very highly. And then I think on the same lines is if you can find people who truly understand the issue and who are leaders in this, I think that's what is helpful, is kind of connecting different people who are paving the ways in your community to work well together. Like, I think that is kind of what has happened in Missouri, is we have found different leaders who truly understand the issue, want to make a difference and work well together. But that can for sure be a challenge, and it doesn't always work great. So I think that's great advice to contact Dan and kind of get things started.
Awesome. And then one last question really quick, was Dan had mentioned that they provide like 6-day training for their law enforcement. So Heidi, is there anything similar for health and medical professionals that's conducted for just anybody who wants to get training, or that's mandatory?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a ton of training that exists for hospitals and for healthcare workers. I think it varies. Adult training should be a little different than pediatric training because trafficking doesn't always look the same in those two groups. And so really, if you go online, like the HEAL protocol, HEAL, that's geared towards healthcare workers. They have a ton of good stuff. You can contact me. I'm happy to help with the education we provide at our hospital, but definitely don't reinvent the wheel. Tons of it already exists for healthcare workers.
Wonderful. And then we had another one just come in right now. How could homeless outreach workers begin initiating collaboration with local agencies and identifying victims?
So really, I mean, homeless workers, I mean, really any population that's vulnerable is susceptible to exploitation and trafficking, correct? So homeless outreach workers would be, you know, a great place to start. Just like schools, just like casinos, just like, you know, hotels, train depots, all the truck stops, you know, they're coming into contact with those people. Really, the first thing is going to be able to be recognizing what trafficking is and what trafficking isn't, you know, because there's this myth out there that, you know, it's like the movie Taken, where a van pulls up and you grab somebody, throw them in a van and drive off. And that's not what trafficking, that's not what we see. Does that stuff happen from time to time? Yeah, but not generally. It's not what we see. So there's training that you can get. And I think it would be a great thing for those folks to get some training and then start to develop those lines of who to call. I mean, if you're in like a municipal area, most large municipalities in this day and age are going to have a human trafficking unit or a special victims unit. Know who those detectives are and who you need to call when you have stuff. Or maybe you have a community oriented police officer in that area where your homeless population is, whether it's a shelter or whatever it is. Get to know that person. So you start developing those lines of communications, because you're going to need the law enforcement folks. You're going to need the victim advocates and the other folks that can provide services to those folks. But that can totally be done. And that's, to me, that's not even a big lift. Just get some training. We provide that training here in Missouri. I'm sure wherever they are, their state probably provides it or their city provides it. And that's something that I don't think would be too hard to implement at all.
Yeah, I agree. I think looking for any like nonprofit or group serving vulnerable populations, looking at what do we want the next step to be? So if we think someone's being exploited, do we take them to an ER? Do we call a social worker? Do we call law enforcement? What do we want to do next? What's most appropriate? And then how do we build a connection with that agency and kind of go from there? So do we take them to the ER? Okay, let's talk to people in the ER and see, are they screening for trafficking? Is this appropriate? How do we streamline this? I think that's a good first step to take to kind of start to build those relationships. I would also say, like, for my own personal experience, once I realized we were seeing trafficking victims, I was like, okay, I'm getting my foot in the door with every trafficking group in Kansas City that I can find, because I want to figure out how do we take better care of these kids? I don't know. There's not a roadmap. So I'm going to attend meetings. I'm going to start meeting people. I'm going to make connections. And that was really kind of how I was able to get connected with like the Attorney General's office and Dan and different people like that, because I reached out and said, okay, what are other people doing that care about this? So I think that's definitely an option, is to see, are there people already doing this work? Can you get connected with them?
Well, awesome. Thank you so much to both of our speakers. I'm going to let everyone go now because we have only a few minutes before our next plenary, and I want to make sure everyone gets time for a break, but definitely make sure to join us for the next plenary as we hear from survivors on survivor-informed strategies to end human trafficking. So we'll see you guys in the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.